I stared at the hospital tray, the IV tugging at my arm as the words on the paper blurred behind my reading glasses. Account closed. Final balance, $0, 0 cents. My son had drained it all. My son, the boy I raised through 2 jobs and sleepless nights. The boy who once cried when I missed his school play, now a man who stole everything while I was under anesthesia, and somehow, I'm the one expected to rest. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. She sat upright in her hospital bed, the stiff gown itching at her collarbone, heart tapping faster. Her fourth line tugged slightly as she reached for her reading glasses and tore it open. Inside, a single-page statement, one account summary, a bold black line across the center. Account closed. Final balance, $0, 0 cents. For a full 10 seconds she couldn't move. Her thumb traced the print like it might smudge or blink into correction. But it didn't. She hit the nurse call button. "Can I use a phone?" she asked, voice firm. "Right now, please." The hold music chirped endlessly as she sat with the receiver pressed against her cheek, staring at the muted television hanging from the wall. Daytime court shows droned in the background, ironic and detached. Finally, a voice answered. "Jefferson Mutual, this is Craig. How can I assist you?" Margaret's tone was crisp. "Yes, I just received a notice that my account was closed. I'm Margaret Doyle. This is a mistake." Craig asked her to verify a few details, then tapped at keys. "Okay, Mrs. Doyle. It says here the closure was authorized by a family member, using a valid power of attorney." The air in her chest shrank. "Excuse me?" Craig repeated himself, slower this time. "By family authority. Looks like your son, David Doyle, submitted the form in person 2 weeks ago." 2 weeks ago. She was still fogged from surgery, her memory a half-light blur. Margaret's voice cooled. "I never signed a power of attorney. I wasn't even fully awake 2 weeks ago." "I understand, ma'am," Craig said carefully, "but it's already processed. I recommend contacting your legal representative." She ended the call without saying goodbye. An hour later, Rachel arrived, out of breath, eyes wide. "I saw the mail on the kitchen table when I stopped by to feed the cats. Dad didn't say anything about this," she said, gripping the edge of the bed. "But he did mention something like handling things now. I thought he meant groceries or home repairs." Margaret watched her granddaughter's face twist with confusion. She remembered when Rachel was 5, asking too many questions during church, fearless and innocent. "He said it was temporary," Rachel added, "just until you were back on your feet." "Temporary theft is still theft," Margaret said softly, almost to herself. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came. By late afternoon, a knock came at the hospital door, 2 short raps, then a pause. That rhythm had belonged to Helen Rivers for 40 years. "Surprise, surprise," Helen said, marching in with a vase of peonies from her own garden and the scent of vanilla hand cream trailing behind her. "You look too damn good to be bedridden." Margaret managed a smile. "Wait until you see the hospital food." Helen set the flowers on the windowsill and leaned in. "I saw David's car at the bank last week, thought it was odd. Now I'm thinking it wasn't just a casual visit." Margaret didn't answer. She reached for the drawer by her bed, pulled out the statement and handed it to Helen without a word. Helen read it once, then twice. Her jaw clenched. "They actually did it." "Looks like it." Helen sat down slowly, folding her arms. "When were you going to tell me?" "I wasn't sure it was real," Margaret admitted. "I thought maybe I misread something." Helen gave her a look. "You've never misread a damn thing in your life." They both went quiet. The peonies fluttered slightly under the hum of the air vent. Rachel stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly, watching her reflection in the glass. Then Margaret leaned in toward Helen, voice low but steady. "They think I'm too weak to fight." Helen didn't blink. "Are they about to find out otherwise?" Margaret's lips pressed into a line, the kind of line a principal gave a child right before the consequence. "Well, damn," she muttered, scrolling through the printed transaction log. "That boy didn't just skim. He swept." Margaret sat propped up against a stack of pillows, a yellow legal pad on her lap, already half filled with her spidery script. The fluorescent hospital lights made her skin look thinner than she liked, but her eyes stayed sharp. "Pull every transaction after March 12th, she said. "That's the day of my surgery." Helen clicked again. Her fingers moved fast. 40 years of bank clerk work hadn't left her muscle memory. Withdrawal, 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 transferred to an external account. She paused. Account holder name, D.D. Doyle. Rachel, sitting in the visitor's chair with her knees pulled up to her chest, leaned forward. "That's Dad's business account. For the flipping thing." Margaret didn't look up. "Keep going." Helen's brow furrowed. "There's a signature form uploaded here. Power of attorney, filed the day after your surgery." Margaret's pen stopped. "Bring me my phone." Luther Grant answered on the second ring. His voice still had the same low rumble she remembered from the school board meetings, back when he was just a parent fighting for better bus routes and she was the one calling roll. "Margaret," he said warmly, "you shouldn't be thinking about bank fraud while you're still in a gown." "I don't have the luxury of waiting, Luther. I need you to look at something." She forwarded the document Helen had pulled. Less than a minute later, he let out a sharp exhale. "This is trash. He filed a power of attorney based on your signature during recovery?" "Sedated," Margaret corrected. "I remember nothing of that day except a morphine pump and a blood pressure cuff that wouldn't stop beeping." "I'll get an affidavit from your attending physician," Luther said. "They'll confirm you weren't of sound mind to sign anything legally binding. That makes this whole authorization invalid." Rachel looked between them, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. "So, what happens now?" Margaret finally looked up from her notepad. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. "We take back what's mine." Later that evening, as Rachel sat by the window again, her shoulders curled inward like a child expecting thunder, Margaret reached out. "You don't have to choose sides," she said gently. "Not with me." But Rachel's voice broke. "He said it was just until you were home. He said you'd be mad at first, but then you'd see it was safer that way." Margaret's hand stayed steady as she turned a page in her notebook. "Is that what you think? That I'm mad?" Rachel's eyes filled. "You're quiet. That's worse." A long silence passed. Then Margaret's voice, soft but steel-spined. "I raised David better than this. Or I thought I did." Rachel looked up. "Maybe he thought you wouldn't fight back." "Then he never knew me at all." Rachel wiped her cheeks with her sleeve. "I'm so sorry, Grandma." Margaret shook her head. "You didn't close my account, sweetheart." Rachel hesitated. "But I saw him bring papers to the hospital. I didn't know what they were, I swear." "I believe you," Margaret said firmly. "But we can't pretend it didn't happen. Not anymore." Helen returned from the nurse's station with a fresh printout. "Found a few more transfers routed through a holding account in Indiana," she said, handing it over. "Same account number, just masked differently. Someone got clever." Margaret circled the routing number with her pen. Then again, harder this time. Luther Grant walked in carrying a slim leather briefcase and the expression of a man who knew exactly where he was going and how long it would take to get there. He nodded to Helen, gave Rachel a gentle smile, and pulled a chair up beside Margaret's bed like he was settling in for a war council. "I stayed up last night reviewing precedent," he said, unclasping the briefcase. "Got your doctor's written statement already. Confirms what we knew. You were under moderate to heavy sedation, not in decision-making condition." He slid a packet of papers across the side table toward Margaret. "This is a petition to revoke the power of attorney. Once signed, we'll file it in Jefferson County Court. I've already scheduled an emergency hearing." Margaret scanned the document. Every page felt like a step back toward herself. "How long until it's official?" Luther tapped his watch. "Couple days, tops. Judge Watson doesn't like delays." Helen pulled a notepad from her purse and held it up. "I wrote a statement. Describes exactly what meds she was on, who visited, what papers were on her tray. Time-stamped and signed." Luther took it, smiling. "You ever consider law school, Helen?" "I prefer a clean spreadsheet and a sharp pair of shears." Rachel looked between them, chewing her lower lip. "Do you want me to say something?" Margaret studied her face, torn still, but no longer drifting. "That's up to you," Margaret said carefully. "No pressure, not from me." Rachel's voice was small but steady. "I'll testify, if it comes to that." Margaret nodded once. "Then make sure it's the truth." "It is," Rachel whispered. "I just wish it wasn't." By mid-afternoon, Margaret's hospital tray had been cleared to make space for a metal file box Helen brought from her house. Inside were years of Margaret's records, neatly labeled manila folders, many with hand-typed notes taped to the inside flaps. Birth certificates, pension stubs, the original house deed. "It's all here," Helen said. "I used to tease you for keeping all this. Now I'm damn glad you did." Margaret sifted through the folders with surgical focus. "David doesn't know these exist." "Good," Helen said. "Let's keep it that way." Rachel helped organize the papers, spreading them out across the window ledge and the side table. Every document felt like a thread tying Margaret's life back together. A knock came. 3 taps. A pause. Then the door creaked open and David Doyle walked in like he owned the air. "Hey, Mom," he said, setting down a plastic bag of takeout. "Thought you might want some real food for once." Helen didn't look up. Rachel froze. Margaret kept her hand on a folder marked CD Renewal Notices -2017-2023. David looked around, too casual by half. "What's all this?" he asked, nodding at the papers. Margaret met his eyes. "Just reviewing some old files." David chuckled. "You really shouldn't be stressing about that stuff right now. Recovery first, finances later. I've got it under control." The room held still. Then Margaret spoke, quiet, polite, not a flicker out of place. "So do I." David's smile faltered. "Just a flicker." But Margaret saw it. She'd trained hundreds of kids in her life. She knew when someone realized the test was already happening. "All right," David said, backing toward the door. "Just take it easy, okay?" As he turned to leave, his gaze swept over Luther's briefcase, the stack of court papers, the file box. His hand gripped the door handle a second too long. Helen opened the hospital door just enough to let Kara Doyle slip in, all smooth edges and carefully neutral smiles. She wore cream slacks, a navy blouse that looked dry-cleaned that morning, and the faintest whiff of perfume. Something expensive meant to whisper refinement, not shout it. "Margaret," Kara said, clasping her hands like she was stepping into a prayer circle. "You look wonderful. Honestly, so much better than I expected." Margaret glanced up from her reading glasses, one brow lifting half a degree. "Surgery does wonders for the complexion." Kara laughed, too brightly, and moved to sit in the chair David had used the day before. Rachel hovered awkwardly in the corner of the room, arms folded, phone half hidden in her hand. "I didn't want to overwhelm you," Kara said, crossing her legs slowly. "Just wanted to check in, woman to woman." Helen cleared her throat and headed for the hallway. "I'll give y'all a minute," she said. To Margaret, she added with a sideways glance, "I'll be at the nurse's station." Rachel hesitated, but Margaret gave her a small nod. She followed Helen out. When the door clicked shut, Kara's shoulders relaxed. "I know this situation looks messy," she began, "but we all want what's best for you. David's just trying to keep things from falling through the cracks while you heal." Margaret didn't respond, just watched her with a schoolteacher's stillness that had once frozen entire classrooms mid-cheat. "I mean," Kara continued, voice softening, "no one's saying you can't manage things. You've always been precise. But maybe now is the time to let go of a few burdens, for peace of mind." She smiled again, wide, warm, practiced. Margaret returned it, nodded slowly. "You might be right." Kara blinked. "Oh?" Margaret folded her hands over her lap, tilting her head ever so slightly. "Peace of mind does sound lovely." Kara's posture softened even more, almost as if she believed she'd cracked something open. "Exactly. That's all we're trying to do." Margaret reached for her water glass, took a sip, set it down with deliberate care. "But peace," she said, voice low, "doesn't come from surrender." Kara's smile faltered just for a second. "Of course," she said quickly, standing. "Anyway, I'll let you rest. Let me know if you need anything." "I will," Margaret said, tone sweet as lemonade. Out in the hallway, Helen was waiting with a manila envelope under her arm. She handed it to Margaret the moment the door closed. Public records search, she said. David's up to his ears. 3 active credit card lawsuits, 2 liens filed against the flip house he bought last spring. Margaret opened the envelope slowly, like she already knew what was inside. He's burning through everything. And Kara's got her name on one of the accounts, Helen added. Joint liability. Margaret exhaled through her nose, the closest she ever came to cursing out loud. No wonder she wants me to back off. Later that night, Rachel lingered near the hospital vending machines, nursing a Sprite and half listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and overhead announcements. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. Not at first. But Kara's voice carried. No, babe, she's buying it. Smiling and nodding like a little old lamb, Kara was saying, phone tucked to her ear. Let the lawyer throw his paper parade. She's still stuck in that bed. If she gives up the accounts, it's over. Silence. Then laughter. I'm telling you, 2 more days and she'll sign everything just to make it stop. David just needs to stay calm and not blow it. Rachel's hand tightened around the can. Her breath caught in her throat. Margaret looked up from her notebook. Helen raised an eyebrow. The silence stretched. Finally, Rachel said, They're trying to liquidate everything. Helen's pen froze mid-line. Rachel stepped closer, voice low, words tumbling out now, as if afraid they'd dissolve if she didn't say them fast enough. I heard her. Kara, on the phone. She said once you hand over the accounts, it's done. That everything's lined up. That Dad's just gotta stay calm and not blow it. Margaret's jaw tensed, but she waited. She needed the whole story, not pieces. They're not managing anything, Rachel said. They're trying to drain it, sell off what they can, use the money for a real estate deal. Helen let out a low whistle. Damn house flippin'. He's been chasing that pipe dream for 3 years. And Kara? She's already leveraged what she could. Rachel nodded. She applied for a loan last week using your Roth and your CD as collateral. The bank flagged it because her name wasn't on the trust. Margaret's voice came quiet and firm. Which bank? Jefferson Mutual, Rachel said. Helen reached for her phone. That's the same rep who flagged the early withdrawals. I've got a contact there. Sandra. 10 minutes later, Luther Grant's voice rang through the speaker on Helen's phone, tight with urgency. She's right, he said. Kara submitted paperwork claiming joint rights as your financial caretaker. If the bank had accepted it, they could have secured the bridge loan by tomorrow. Margaret didn't flinch. So what do we do? Emergency freeze, Luther said. I'll file a temporary injunction with the court and deliver notice to the bank. You have enough documentation now. They'll cooperate. And how fast can we stop them? Helen asked. I'm filing within the hour, Luther replied. No withdrawals, no transfers, nothing moves. Margaret didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Luther already knew. That evening, as the sky outside turned the color of bruised eggplant and rain whispered against the windows, David sat in his pickup outside the hospital. The glow from his laptop illuminated his face, pale, focused, twitchy. He clicked through the Jefferson Mutual portal. Access denied, account locked by legal order. He tried again. Session expired. He clicked furiously, muttering, backspace, re-enter, again, still locked, still nothing. David slammed the laptop shut with a curse that echoed in the cab. Rain thudded harder on the windshield. Margaret had just closed her eyes to rest when the knock exploded against her hospital door. Hard, panicked, angry. Bang, bang, bang. Rachel jumped. Helen stood up fast. David burst in without waiting for permission, rain dripping from his hair, his voice cracking like a whip. What the hell did you do? Margaret's eyes opened, calmly. She didn't flinch. You locked me out, David shouted, stepping closer. Do you have any idea what you've just screwed up? That money was working. It was an investment. Helen stepped between them like a bouncer. Back up, David. This is family business, he snapped. Margaret's voice sliced through the room. This is my business, my life, my home, my name on every deposit. You were never given permission to dismantle it. David's breath hitched. His hands trembled. You're blowing this out of proportion. You emptied my savings, she said coldly. That's not proportion. That's looting. You don't understand what we're trying to do. Rachel finally stood. Then explain it. David turned to her, stunned. "You're on her side now?" "I'm on the side that isn't lying," Rachel said. Helen was the one who opened it, standing by the window of Margaret's hospital room. Her eyes scanned the page once, then again. She gave a single nod. All accounts frozen, no withdrawals, no online access, effective immediately, pending court hearing. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply exhaled and returned to her therapy band exercises, the resistance straps stretching slowly between her palms. Across the room, Rachel sat cross-legged on the couch, laptop open, typing notes into a spreadsheet Helen had labeled Case Evidence, Doyle v. Doyle. Downtown, in a rented office suite thick with artificial lemon-scented air freshener, Kara stared at her laptop screen in growing horror. "Rejected," she said aloud, voice rising. David leaned over her shoulder, unshaven, eyes bloodshot. "Try again. Refresh the screen." She did. Same result. Loan status declined. Reason, collateral in legal dispute. "They flagged everything." "Ing," she whispered. "Every line tied to your mom's name is locked up. We can't touch a dime." David paced, jaw grinding. "That was our bridge. Without it, we're exposed." Kara didn't say anything, just sat back in her chair and stared at the blinking cursor in her inbox, where 3 creditors had already begun sending follow-up notices. 3 days later, Margaret was discharged into Rachel's care. The house smelled like dust and lemon oil. Helen had come through with a deep clean while they were gone. Rachel had already moved into the guest room, setting up a little folding table in the corner of the dining room with manila folders, a scanner, and color-coded Post-it flags. "Think of it like a research project," Helen said, flipping through the receipts. "Only instead of a term paper, we're building a wall." "A wall against what?" Rachel asked. Helen didn't answer right away. She pulled out a document and pointed. "Against that? Look at the date. He was pulling funds 2 days before she even had the breathing tube out." Rachel's throat tightened. "He thought she wouldn't make it, didn't he?" Helen didn't look up. "He didn't plan on her waking up ready for war." Margaret's steps were slow but deliberate. With each lap down the hallway, the cane grew less necessary. Her eyes were clearer now, sharper. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it landed like a gavel. She spent hours each day at the kitchen table, sorting through decades of financial records with the precision of a courtroom clerk. "I was never one to forget where a penny went," she said. "Now I have to remember every single one." Rachel found herself watching her grandmother differently now, not just as a matriarch, but as a survivor who knew how to rebuild a ruined structure from the foundation up. And then came the whispers. At the corner pharmacy, David was overheard telling a neighbor Margaret had become confused lately, that rehab wasn't working, and that it was probably time someone stepped in to protect her from herself. At the church social, Kara told a small circle of women that Margaret had been forgetting names, and that they were genuinely concerned about her capacity to make good decisions. Helen heard both accounts by noon and was at the house by 1. "He's planting seeds," she said flatly, "trying to build a narrative before the hearing." Margaret looked up from a binder of property tax records. "So let him." Rachel's head snapped up. "You're not worried?" "I'm furious," Margaret said calmly. "But fear? That's what they need to win, and I don't lose to fear." That night, Rachel found an old video in a dusty DVD case labeled Retirement Speech. May 2009. She played it on her laptop while Margaret rested in the recliner beside her. On the screen, Margaret stood behind a podium, wearing her blue dress and that familiar, no-nonsense smile. She was addressing a packed gymnasium. "Teaching isn't about control," she said. "It's about standards, expectations. You don't protect children by coddling them. You teach them to think, to prepare, to fight for what's right." Rachel glanced over. Margaret's eyes were open, watching the screen. Rachel found it first, tucked among utility bills and a grocery store flyer. She flipped it over and froze when she saw the sender. Jefferson County District Court. By the time Margaret opened it at the dining table, she already knew. Petition for guardianship appointment. David Doyle. Grounds: mental decline due to age and medical recovery. The paper didn't shake in Margaret's hand. But Rachel watched her thumb press into the corner just a fraction too long, like she was holding herself in place. "Cowards trying to win without a fight?" Helen said flatly. Margaret didn't look up. "He's not trying to win. He's trying to erase me." Luther arrived within the hour. He read the petition standing up, eyes scanning fast, lips pressed into a tight line. "They're leaning on the post-operative confusion clause," he said, "claiming you're disoriented, forgetful, emotionally reactive." Margaret gave a dry laugh. "Should have run with 'possessed by Satan.' Would have had more teeth." "I'm filing a counter today," Luther said, already pulling papers from his briefcase. "Your medical evaluations since discharge show no sign of cognitive decline," Helen chimed in, pulling a small folder from her purse. "I spoke with the head nurse at the hospital. 3 staff members wrote affidavits after your last therapy session, said you were the sharpest patient they'd seen all month." Luther looked impressed. "How'd you manage that?" "I asked," Helen said, "like someone who used to approve mortgage loans." Upstairs, Rachel was scanning text threads from the backup of her dad's old iPad, the one she'd borrowed for studying months ago and forgotten to return. Most messages were innocuous. Then she found it. "Kara, 2 weeks ago. She's frail but still stubborn. Think we need to play the crazy card harder. David, you think the judge will buy it?" Kara, "They always do, especially when it's a sweet old lady acting lucid." Gaslight with a smile. "Works every time." Rachel stared at the screen, mouth dry. She copied the messages, time-stamped them, and printed them out in triplicate. At dinner that night, Margaret sat at the head of the table like always. Chicken pot pie, Helen's recipe. Rachel barely touched her plate. "They're going to try to make you seem unstable in court," Rachel finally said. Margaret sipped her water. "Of course they are." "They're twisting everything," Rachel continued, her voice breaking. "It's not just wrong, it's evil." Margaret set her glass down gently. "Let them twist. I've spent my life showing people the difference between noise and truth. Judges aren't swayed by panic, they're swayed by facts." Helen nodded. "And we've got plenty of those." "But if you get angry," Rachel started. Margaret cut her off gently. "I won't." "You're not even worried?" "Oh, I'm worried," Margaret said. "But worried doesn't mean weak." When Luther returned 3 days later, he brought news. "Judge Daniels reviewed both petitions," he said. "He's decided to consolidate. Guardianship hearing and financial control case will be held simultaneously, 2 weeks from Friday." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Is that good?" Luther nodded. "Very. It means the judge is taking this seriously, and he doesn't like people wasting court time." Margaret stood slowly, one hand still on the chair back. "Well then," she said, "we'll make it worth his while." That night, Rachel slipped into Margaret's room with a folder of documents, but paused when she saw the light was still on and her grandmother was staring out the window. "Couldn't sleep?" Margaret shook her head. "Storm coming. I can feel it in my hip." Rachel crossed the room and sat beside her. "They're not ready for what you're going to do, are they?" Margaret didn't smile. Now it held a different kind of preparation, one built not from charity, but resolve. Helen sat at one end, hunched over a line of 3-ring binders, her fingers moving like a surgeon's as she attached labeled tabs, medical affidavits, bank statements, text evidence, character witnesses. Rachel manned the printer by the deep freezer, collecting page after page as they fed out warm. Every so often she'd pause to staple and breathe. At the other end, Margaret sat upright in a lawn chair, shoulders squared, a legal pad in her lap. She wasn't reading. She was remembering, combing her mind for the cleanest way to state the truth without theatrics. Because this wasn't going to be a soap opera. It was going to be a reckoning. Luther dropped by that afternoon with a clipboard of witness confirmations. "Your physician signed on," he said, flipping through the sheets. "So did 2 nurses from post-op. Your neighbor, Patty Miller, she's prepared to testify she sees you walking your property line and watering your porch plants every morning." Margaret gave a single nod. "Good." He tapped another sheet. "Your former vice principal, Harold Benson, said you corrected his grammar at a potluck last year and he hasn't trusted his own commas since." That drew a smile, Small, but genuine. Witness list is clean, Luther added. Not excessive, not showy. People who've known you for years. That matters. Helen looked up. And what about Rachel? I've been thinking about that, Luther said. It's risky. They'll try to rattle her. Rachel looked up from the printer. Let them try. Margaret didn't turn to face her. Are you sure? Rachel walked over, her steps measured, and set a fresh stack of highlighted statements on the table. He's my father, but you're the one who's told me the truth. Every time. Always. She sat down beside her grandmother. I want them to hear that. Margaret watched her closely. If you're going to speak, speak clearly. Speak once. No tears. Rachel nodded. I won't cry. Margaret reached over and gently laid a hand over Rachel's. Even if you do, cry on your feet. By early evening, the garage had turned into a mock courtroom. The tool rack had been covered with a bedsheet. A space heater hummed in the corner. Luther sat across from Margaret while Helen timed responses with her kitchen stopwatch. Start with your name and background, Luther said. Margaret straightened. Margaret Doyle, 70 years old, former school principal, retired 12 years ago, financially independent my entire adult life. Why do you believe your son filed a fraudulent power of attorney? Because I never authorized it, and I was under sedation when the documents were signed. What do you believe his motive was? To gain control of my assets, and based on recent findings, to liquidate them for personal debt. Helen clicked the stopwatch. 42 seconds. You've got plenty of room to slow it down and breathe. Luther looked up. No need to be dramatic. You're not putting on a show. You're putting down a foundation. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. I don't need drama. She looked Luther in the eye. Truth's all I've ever taught. After dinner, they worked until almost midnight. Copies were collated, color-coded tabs checked again, USB backups created and labeled. Rachel placed a handwritten sticky note inside each binder. Truth doesn't panic. It prepares. As the house finally quieted, Margaret stood by her bedroom window, looking out over her front lawn. Still perfectly edged, the porch light catching the edges of her wind chimes. Behind her, the binders sat stacked neatly on the dresser, ready for transport. She didn't move, didn't speak. But in the stillness, her fingers flexed slightly, as if gripping an invisible gavel. Margaret stepped out of the car slowly, bracing her cane in one hand and resting the other on Rachel's arm. She wore a navy wool coat and a brooch shaped like a fountain pen, the same one she'd worn the day she retired. Her lipstick was faint. Her spine was straight. Rachel walked beside her in low heels, binder pressed against her chest. Helen followed close behind, clutching a tote full of documents like it might detonate. Inside, the hallway echoed with the shuffle of papers and the clipped steps of attorneys. Margaret's breath didn't waver once. Courtroom 3B smelled faintly of varnish and lemon cleaner. The judge hadn't taken the bench yet. David and Kara sat at the opposite table, whispering furiously. Kara wore a blazer too expensive for the stress on her face. David wore smugness like armor. The second he spotted Margaret enter, his lips curled into a half-smile, a smirk that faltered when she walked without faltering. Rachel didn't look at him. Helen didn't even glance. Margaret simply took her seat, adjusted her binder, and folded her hands like the hearing was a meeting she'd called. The bailiff called order. Judge Daniels entered, tall, silver-haired, and with the permanent squint of a man who had no time for nonsense. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with the weary patience of someone used to sorting chaos into truth. Let's begin. Luther rose first. In response to the guardianship petition filed by Mr. David Doyle, he began, we present evidence establishing that Margaret Doyle is fully competent, financially and cognitively, and that Mr. Doyle's actions reflect not protection, but calculated misappropriation. He moved methodically. First, the physician's report, then the nursing affidavits, then Helen's sworn timeline of post-op medication, every point built on the last, like steel beams welded one by one. Margaret didn't flinch as he recounted her account balances, the timing of withdrawals, or the credit inquiries Kara had initiated. She simply watched the judge, calm as a chess master, letting someone else move first. When Luther presented the printed messages between Kara and David, the judge's eyebrows lifted for the first time. "Gaslight with a smile," he read aloud. "Works every time?" Kara shifted in her seat. David looked at his lap. Luther turned. "We call Rachel Doyle." Rachel rose, binder still in hand. She walked up with slow, steady steps, her cheeks flushed but chin high. "Tell us about your grandmother's condition," Luther said. Rachel nodded once. She wasn't confused. Not ever. She was recovering. But she knew who she was. She knew what she owned, and she never, not once, asked my dad to take control. "And your father's behavior?" Rachel's voice didn't crack. "He said it was temporary. He told me he was helping her. But the moment he thought no one was watching, he moved the money, applied for loans, lied about her state of mind. This wasn't about care, it was about control." Luther gave her a small nod. No further questions. On cross, David stood and approached her, visibly tense, papers in hand. "Rachel, isn't it true you said yourself that Grandma looked weak, that she needed help?" "I said she was tired," Rachel replied. "Not incapable." David pressed harder. "Didn't you text me that she's not herself lately?" Rachel stared straight at him. "Yeah, she wasn't herself. She was disappointed. That's not confusion. That's clarity." David opened his mouth again, then hesitated. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Doyle?" David shuffled his notes. "No further questions." He sat down too fast. Kara took the stand next. Her voice was syruped with concern, but her answers wobbled under Luther's cross. She couldn't recall who helped her file loan paperwork. She wasn't sure which of Margaret's accounts had been used. The judge frowned, scribbled something. Helen whispered to Margaret, "That man just smelled a lie." Margaret said nothing, just watched as Kara twisted a tissue in her hands. By late afternoon, both arguments had been heard. The judge set down his pen and sighed. "This court is prepared to issue preliminary findings, but not a ruling." Margaret's lips tightened. "Due to the complexity of the financial documentation," the judge continued, "and the volume of new material entered into evidence, I will require additional review time." He looked to both tables. "Court is adjourned until 9 a.m., Monday morning. Counsel are warned, no material changes to financial assets, communications, or care plans are to be made between now and then. Any violation will be treated as contempt." She sipped gas station coffee and squinted through the rain-smeared windshield, hands steady on the wheel like she was back doing night audits in '87. And then, there, Kara. She pulled up in a black sedan, not David's truck. A man in a camel overcoat stepped out of the passenger side. Older, clipboard in hand. Not a banker, not a loan officer. A fixer, Helen thought. The kind you call when you're down to your last trick and too proud to admit you're cornered. They entered the bank's side door, after hours access. Helen didn't reach for her phone. She had already texted Luther. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Clock's running out, sweetheart." At 10:12 p.m., Luther called from his home office, voice crisp despite the hour. They tried initiating a wire transfer. Out-of-state holding company. The system flagged it within 90 seconds and froze the route. He exhaled into the receiver. "They're scared. And sloppy." Helen didn't ask how he knew. Some lawyers worked 9 to 5. Luther had always played to the whistle. "They're going to spin it," Helen said. "Call it a mistake, a clerical mix-up." "They can try," Luther replied, "but the judge already warned them." "Then we document it." "Already in motion." Back at the house, Rachel stood in the kitchen, gripping her phone so hard the plastic casing creaked. The light above the sink flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the tile. Her father's voice had just gone to voicemail. Again, she hit redial. And again, nothing. When she finally looked up, Margaret was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a soft robe pulled tight around her waist. Rachel's voice cracked. He knew they weren't supposed to touch anything, and he still went. Margaret stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like crossing a fault line. "He's your father," she said gently. "But that doesn't make you responsible for what he's become." Rachel shook her head. jaw clenched. "I feel like I've been choosing wrong this whole time. And I hate him for making me feel that." Margaret didn't flinch. "This isn't your shame to carry, Rachel." She reached out and took her granddaughter's trembling hand. "It's his, and one day he'll feel the weight of it." Later that night, as the house finally quieted, Margaret sat at her desk. Not the dining table, not the kitchen counter, but her old oak desk with the shallow drawer full of faded paper clips and monogrammed notepads from board meetings gone by. She opened a fresh pad and began writing her closing statement in black ink. No dramatics, no scolding, just clarity, each sentence precise, each pause placed like a period in a lesson plan. When she was done, she set down her pen and exhaled, not from fatigue, but from certainty. By Sunday morning, the house had visitors. 3 neighbors stopped by before noon, 2 with casseroles and 1 with a pie. None asked for the story. They already knew it. In pieces, in rumors, in quiet disapproval voiced at grocery aisles and post office counters. They didn't come for gossip. They came for loyalty. "I was there when she led the levy campaign," one said. "I'd stand with her any day." "First person who told my son he was smart," said another. "Not gonna forget that now." Helen noted names and phone numbers on her yellow pad. "Just in case," she said. Margaret stood at the door, her back straight, nodding softly as they spoke. No tears, no trembling. Just an iron steadiness that pulled people closer without asking them to come. That evening, Rachel sat at the porch swing with a blanket over her knees, watching the breeze rattle the hanging chimes. Inside, Margaret sat once more at her desk, reading over her closing remarks in silence. She held Rachel's arm not for balance, but out of quiet solidarity. Her posture was unchanged, her pace deliberate. Helen followed behind carrying a binder that no longer needed checking. It was no longer about proof, it was about what came next. Across the aisle, David sat alone. Kara's chair was empty. A courthouse whisper had placed her at the airport earlier that morning. No goodbyes, no eye contact, just exit. David hadn't shaved. His suit didn't fit. He looked like a boy waiting for punishment, not a man who'd nearly pulled off a theft by trust. Judge Daniels entered at precisely 9:01 a.m. No small talk, no delay. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Margaret first, as though she'd earned that. "This court has reviewed all supplemental evidence, including records submitted over the weekend," he said. "I want to be clear. Few matters require more care than the question of competence and control, and yet, in this case, the answer is unambiguous." David shifted in his seat. "The court finds the power of attorney invalid, filed under circumstances that render it both legally and ethically void a pause." Margaret didn't blink. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the guardianship petition is denied. The respondent, Mrs. Doyle, is not only competent but has demonstrated, through testimony and evidence, a level of organization and cognitive clarity that many would do well to aspire to." Helen let out a single, quiet exhale. Rachel closed her eyes for 1 second, no more, before opening them wide again. "As of this ruling," the judge concluded, "all financial access previously granted to David Doyle is revoked. He is to be removed from any accounts, trusts, or shared instruments pertaining to Margaret Doyle, effective immediately. Any further interference will be treated as a violation of this order and subject to legal consequences." David's head dipped. Not dramatically, but in that small motion, the courtroom felt like it folded in on him. Deflated. Exposed. The judge closed his folder. "Mrs. Doyle, your estate is yours once again." He tapped the gavel once. Just once. "Court is adjourned." They stepped out into the hallway in a wash of hushed claps and murmured greetings from strangers who'd watched the case unfold with increasing interest. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't boast. She simply turned to Luther and extended her hand. He took it, smiling. "It's been a privilege." "You brought the facts," she said. "I just brought the memory." Rachel slipped her arm around Margaret's waist and held tight. "You did it." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "We did." Outside the courthouse, David stood on the steps alone, staring down at his phone like it might ring with an alternate reality. When Margaret passed him, she didn't stop, but she did look at him. Not with hate, not with triumph, with pity, and something far worse for a man like David, certainty. He'd lost. Helen caught up beside her. Guess she really did take the first flight out. Margaret gave a faint nod. She packed light. Back at the house, the casserole dishes were already being cleared, the porch swept, the mailbox full of hand-signed cards. One note read, "We never doubted you." Another, "Integrity is louder than noise." That evening, after a quiet dinner and too much pie, the sun dipped low over the edge of Margaret's back fence. Luther stayed for one last coffee, sitting on the porch swing with his coat folded beside him. He looked out over the darkening lawn, then to Margaret. "Well," he said, "now the real rebuilding begins." Margaret sipped her tea. "I already started," she replied. Margaret was pouring coffee, her motion unhurried. Rachel answered the house phone, voice still scratchy from sleep. "Yes, this is Rachel Doyle. I'm her granddaughter. Can I ask who's calling?" She listened, then froze. "Hold on 1 second," she said, cupping the receiver. "Grandma, it's the bank. They say there's a certificate of deposit, in your name, opened years ago by Grandpa." Margaret turned slowly. "Put it on speaker." The banker's voice was soft, professional. "Mrs. Doyle, we were reviewing account linkages after the court order was finalized. During that process, we found a dormant CD account, opened by your late husband in 2003. It had instructions not to renew after maturity. It matured 4 months ago, but it hasn't been claimed." Margaret's hand rested lightly on the counter. "And the amount?" she asked. A pause. $146,390.04, the banker said. "It's accrued interest across 3 decades. Would you like us to issue a cashier's check? Or—" "No," Margaret said. "I'd like to move it into a living trust." Irrevocable, Rachel blinked. "That's enough to cover everything. The house, your care, everything." Margaret nodded. "And then some." The banker took the trust paperwork details and scheduled an in-person meeting. The call ended quietly. For a beat, the kitchen was silent. Then Rachel sat down hard in the nearest chair, head in her hands. Tears came before she could stop them, silent at first, then rising like a storm she couldn't hold back. Margaret didn't say a word. She just came over and placed both hands gently on Rachel's shoulders. Rachel looked up, cheeks wet. "It's over, isn't it? Like really over. He can't get anything else. He can't touch anything." Helen walked in from the front porch just in time to hear that. She slipped off her sunglasses. "No," she said, voice flat. "He'll never touch a cent again." Rachel wiped her face, laughing through the last of the tears. "That money. He tried to steal everything and still missed the biggest piece. Because it wasn't his to even imagine," Margaret said. Later that morning, Margaret met with Luther in his office, smaller than you'd expect, tucked between a cafe and an optometrist downtown. She handed over the signed trust documents. "I want Rachel named primary successor trustee," she said. "Not after I die. Now. If anything happens, she steps in." Luther blinked. "You sure?" "She's earned it." He didn't argue. He simply pulled out his notary stamp. By dusk, the papers were filed, the money secured, the trust untouchable. And in the corner of Margaret's study, her husband's old shoebox of ledgers sat open for the first time in years. Rachel sat cross-legged on the rug beside it, flipping through faded pages with wide eyes. "He tracked every cent," she said, awed. "I didn't even know they still gave out passbooks like this." Margaret smiled faintly, one finger brushing across a line of tidy cursive. "He believed in saving for the storm you never see coming." Rachel looked up. "You think he knew this might happen?" "I think he knew something always happens," Margaret said, "and he wanted me to stand, no matter what it was." She looked out the window where dusk was turning the lawn a burnished gold. "He left the rope. I just had to pull myself back up." At twilight, Helen arrived with peach cobbler in foil and that familiar, "I brought tea but I also brought news" expression. "Word's out," she said, setting down the dessert. "David called his old buddy at the hardware store, tried to cash in favors. No one's answering." Rachel raised an eyebrow. He's still trying to scramble? Helen snorted. It's done. Every door is closing on him now. Margaret didn't look up from the trust binder she was reviewing. Good, she said. Let him hear them all lock. Not loud, not aggressive, just pointed. The kind of cough followed by a sideways glance and a murmured, "Such a shame." Margaret sat in the fourth pew at First Presbyterian, the same spot she'd claimed for 30 years, Rachel beside her, hymn book open, knuckles white. By the second hymn, Margaret heard the rustle, whispered pieces of a story reshaped by those who hadn't earned it. She seemed confused last time I saw her at the market. I heard the granddaughter's been handling everything since March. She lost a whole account, didn't she? Margaret didn't turn. She just sang louder. On key. Rachel squeezed her hand. At Donnelly's grocery the next morning, 2 women from the prayer circle paused near the cereal aisle when Margaret walked by. One offered a thin smile. The other didn't look at her at all. Rachel watched them from the corner. "I'm sorry," she muttered. Margaret reached for a box of bran flakes without flinching. "Let them talk. I'm not here to correct whispers." Rachel tilted her chin. "Maybe I am." By Wednesday, Rachel had written a long post on the town's Facebook page. Not angry, not emotional, just facts. My grandmother didn't mismanage anything. She was targeted. She fought back. She won. The record is public. Her name is clear. If you have questions, ask us. Don't whisper about us. The post was shared 38 times. Margaret didn't say a word about it, until 3 separate neighbors dropped by with cookies. Helen went further. She pulled names from an old yearbook and started calling Margaret's retired colleagues. By the weekend, 8 of them had submitted written character statements to Luther. "She ran the tightest school I ever taught in," one wrote. "You think a woman like that forgets her bank balance? I'd trust her with my pension, my dog, and my granddaughter. I once saw her correct a superintendent in front of a packed gymnasium, with citations. Helen organized them into a printed binder with a floral cover titled Community Voices. She placed it on Margaret's porch with a post-it, just in case. Margaret smiled when she saw it. "I like the cover." Meanwhile, Luther was less poetic. He sent 4 cease-and-desist letters to individuals spreading false claims, legalese sharpened by his signature calm. Continued defamatory speech will be documented and pursued to the fullest extent. No one responded. No one dared. David, on the other hand, stopped showing up altogether. His name vanished from the hardware co-op roster, from Rotary Club emails, from weekend poker invites. One neighbor spotted him pacing the sidewalk outside the liquor store on Shelby Avenue, alone, eyes hollow, pretending to check his phone. Another said he'd been seen in the back of the old library, trying to print resumes. Rachel heard the rumors, but Margaret never asked. As for Kara, she deleted her social media, took down the real estate website, and stopped returning calls. Even Rachel's last text, a single wordless "why," stayed unread. By early September, Margaret met with Luther for one final piece of business. She handed him a notarized addendum to the trust. "I want Rachel to inherit the house outright," she said, "and the CD funds. Full control, no delay, no executor, no contingencies." Luther looked it over. "This locks everything in. Nothing passes through probate, nothing for David to contest." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." He paused. "You know this is permanent, right?" "That's the point." He slid the document into a fireproof folder. "Then it's done." Margaret secures her estate beyond David's reach permanently, elevating Rachel as heir. That night, Rachel came home from class to find Margaret in the kitchen, a stack of old recipe cards beside her and a casserole in the oven. "Smells like—" Rachel began. "Victory," Helen said, walking in behind her with a wine bottle in hand. They laughed, harder than they had in weeks. Margaret handed Rachel a small envelope. "What's this?" "Your name, your future, in writing." Rachel opened it. Inside was a copy of the trust, stamped, signed, final. Her hands trembled. "I don't know what to say." Margaret raised her glass. Not a text, not a phone call. A handwritten note slipped under Rachel's door in the early morning hours. "Dinner, just us, 7 p.m. M." Rachel found Helen already in the kitchen when she came downstairs holding her own copy. She even put RSVP on the back, Helen said, eyebrows raised. She's up to something, Rachel replied. She's earned the right, Helen said simply. The table was set with the good china, the white and blue floral set that only came out on Easter and anniversaries. Margaret had cooked herself, lemon chicken, roasted carrots, and a berry tart that still steamed slightly on the stovetop. They ate quietly at first, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Rachel noticed the way Margaret's hands moved, steady, unshaking. She poured the tea herself, didn't hesitate once. When dessert was served, Margaret stood. "I wanted tonight to be quiet," she said, "and complete." Rachel and Helen both looked up. "I've spent the last 5 months fighting to keep what I earned," Margaret continued. "But tonight I want to talk about what I'm choosing to give." She reached into a drawer behind her, pulled out a small box, and set it gently on the table. Rachel stared. Inside, a single gold key, clean, polished, heavy. "Starting tomorrow," Margaret said, "I'm stepping back. Not because I'm tired, not because I've been beaten, but because I'm finally at peace, and because I trust you, Rachel. Fully." Rachel's throat tightened. "You mean, I've named you the sole trustee," Margaret said. "You already knew that, but I want more than paperwork. I want you to know that everything I've protected is yours to grow." Rachel's hands hovered over the key like it might melt if touched too soon. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered. "You are," Margaret said, "and if you ever aren't, you'll get ready. That's what we do." Helen raised her glass. "To choosing family by choice, not just by blood." Margaret's eyes softened. "Exactly." They clinked glasses, quietly but with weight. Later, after the kitchen was clean and Margaret had gone to rest, Rachel and Helen sat on the front porch under a blanket, listening to the wind slide through the trees. "I thought today would feel heavy," Rachel said. Helen nodded. "But it feels like breathing again." Helen leaned back in the chair. "Freedom always does, especially when you earn it the hard way." The next morning brought envelopes, some left in the mailbox, some slid under the door. All hand-addressed. One was from a neighbor named Clara who once borrowed a lawnmower and never forgot the kindness. "You remind me of her. Strong, fair, steady." Another came from a former student, now a lawyer himself. "She was my first compass. Now I see she still is." Rachel lined them up on the counter. Margaret read each one aloud, slowly, like tasting something rich and rare. She looked out the window when she was done. The yard was quiet. No watchers, no whispers, just home. That evening, Rachel opened the study and began organizing the new files Luther had sent: quarterly disbursements, estate protections, land use rights. Margaret watched from the doorway for a long moment. "You know," she said, "you're better at this than I ever was at your age." Rachel looked over her shoulder. "That's because I had you at mine." Margaret smiled. Margaret glanced at the screen once, then deleted it. No hesitation, no curiosity. Whatever apology or excuse it held wasn't hers to manage. Some doors closed so tightly they became walls. She had learned that. She had earned that. The porch swing creaked softly as it moved, pushed by nothing but habit and the last breath of a southern summer. Margaret sat with a cup of mint tea, the porcelain warm between her hands. Rachel beside her, legs tucked up, the gold key from the trust looped through a chain around her neck. They didn't speak at first. The cicadas filled the gaps with their relentless, ancient music. Then Margaret said, "Have you thought about what you'll do next?" Rachel blinked. "You mean, now that it's over?" Margaret sipped her tea. "It's not over. It's beginning. That key doesn't just open a file cabinet." Rachel smiled. "I've been looking at graduate programs, policy work, or education law." Margaret didn't respond right away. She just nodded slowly. "Use your voice," she said, "loud when you need it, sharp when it counts, but don't waste it defending what never deserved you." Rachel looked out toward the street. The old Doyle mailbox stood straight again, repainted, no longer dented from David's careless slam months ago. "I don't think I realized until now how much of my life was shaped by staying quiet." Margaret turned to her. "I taught for 40 years, she said. "Math, mostly. Budgets, planning. But this, she gestured around them, slow and wide, this was my hardest lesson. For both of us. Rachel tilted her head. What was it? Margaret's gaze sharpened, not cold, not unkind, just clear. That loyalty without discernment is just a leash, and survival, when done right, becomes legacy. The words hung in the air like a benediction. As the sky faded from copper to blue-black, the porch light clicked on automatically. The fan above them turned lazily, pushing air heavy with jasmine and memory. A car drove past, slow, respectful. Margaret waved, didn't know the driver, didn't need to. Across the street, someone was grilling. Music played low from a tinny speaker. Laughter echoed faintly between fences. The world had moved on, and, for once, it had left her exactly where she wanted to be. Home. Whole. Rachel stood to refill their tea. Want honey this time? No, Margaret said, smiling. I like it sharp. Later, when the house was quiet and Rachel had gone to bed, Margaret returned to the porch alone. She brought the ledger box with her this time, her husband's scrawl still visible on the edges. She set it beside her, unopened. Not everything needed to be reviewed anymore. The future was filed, her accounts were secure, the trust active, the bank letters final, the judge's ruling irreversible. She had been erased once, briefly, cruelly, and without permission, and she had rewritten herself, line by line. She reached for her tea, still warm, then leaned back against the swing. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet it rang like iron. They closed my account. I closed their access to everything.